Most people think of the Vatican as a museum in the open air, a place of marble, frescoes, pilgrims, tourists, and the polished surface of faith. But that image hides something much older and much darker, because beneath the Vatican is not just stone. It is a buried Roman world, a world of tombs sealed alive under earth, bones wrapped in gold cloth, a forgotten inscription no one read for nearly 2,000 years, a fresco where Christ seems to wear the face of a pagan sun god, secret excavations carried out in wartime darkness while SS officers walked only meters above, and an archived document that might have changed the fate of an entire knightly order if anyone had found it 7 centuries earlier. The Vatican is small on the map, but vertically, it may be one of the deepest places in history, because the deeper you go, the less it feels like a church state, and the more it feels like a sealed chamber of memory, power, and unfinished questions. Tonight, we are descending level by level beneath the Vatican, from the bright surface of St. Peter's Square down into necropolises, catacombs, wartime tunnels, forgotten bones, and one of the most secretive archives on earth. Because under the most famous church in the world, history was not erased, it was buried. At the surface, everything begins in a place millions of people know, St. Peter's Square. Open sky, sweeping colonnades, a perfect stage for ceremony and spectacle. And at the center stands one of the strangest objects in all of Vatican City, an ancient Egyptian obelisk. Most visitors see it as decoration, a monument, a beautiful relic transported from another civilization. But in narrative terms, it is something much more powerful. It is a witness, because this stone existed long before the modern Vatican rose around it. It stood through imperial Rome, through violence, through public punishment, through centuries of transformation. It connects the clean geometry of the square with a world of blood, dust, execution, and empire. That contrast is what matters, because the Vatican does not begin as a peaceful, polished religious space. It rises out of a landscape once tied to Roman power and Roman cruelty. Tradition places this area near the site of the persecution of early Christians under Nero, and whether viewed through strict archaeology or layered memory, the symbolic force is immense. Tourists now stand in sunlight taking photographs. But beneath that same zone lies a deeper terrain of death and devotion. And the obelisk, silent and immovable, becomes the perfect opening image for the whole story. It tells us that the Vatican's surface is not false, but it is incomplete. Because the square is not the whole truth. It is the lid. And beneath that lid lies a city of the dead. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies one of the most extraordinary hidden spaces in Christianity, a Roman necropolis. Not just a few graves, not just a sacred chamber, but an actual funerary street, a small city of the dead with tombs, mausoleums, inscriptions, family memorials, and carefully structured spaces for remembrance. And what makes this even more astonishing is the way it disappeared. It was not gradually lost to time in some accidental collapse. It was deliberately buried. When Emperor Constantine chose to build the first great basilica associated with St. Peter, the terrain posed a problem. The site was uneven, occupied, and already filled with tomb structures. So instead of clearing it in the modern sense, a massive engineering decision was made. The area was filled in. A street lined with mausoleums was entombed beneath layers of earth and construction, creating the foundation for a new sacred world above. That means the Christian monument did not erase the Roman past. It pressed down on top of it. And this is where the story becomes more than architectural. Because once you imagine the necropolis not as ruins, but as a living space of mourning, everything changes. Imagine a Roman mourning in the first centuries of our era. A woman walks that funerary road carrying oil, flowers, or offerings. She pauses before a family tomb. She reads a name. She speaks to someone who is gone. Around her stand walls painted for the dead, niches cut for memory, and inscriptions left by those who wanted love to survive burial. Then, centuries later, all of it is swallowed under fill and stone, not destroyed, buried alive. That is why this level of the Vatican feels so haunting, because it is not only old, it is compressed, an entire urban emotional world sealed beneath the feet of future pilgrims. And the deeper truth is this: Christian Rome did not rise on empty ground, it rose over the dead. And during the 20th century, men began digging down to find them again, in absolute secrecy, during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. In 1939, as Europe moved into catastrophe, another secret descent began beneath the Vatican. Under Pope Pius XII, excavations were launched below St. Peter's Basilica. And the timing makes the story feel like a thriller. Because while war reshaped the continent, workers and researchers were moving underground beneath one of the most symbolically charged places on Earth, trying to uncover what lay below the Basilica. These were not public archaeological tours. These were tightly controlled, delicate excavations in a politically dangerous time. This is where the atmosphere of the Vatican story becomes cinematic. Dust, narrow passages, artificial light, the claustrophobia of buried structures, and above them, a Europe consumed by fear, surveillance, occupation, and war. Accounts from the excavation period have the tension of a film scene. Men working by weak light, spaces so tight and fragile that every movement mattered. The sense that history was being opened in secret, while another kind of history, violent and immediate, was unfolding on the surface. And that contrast is perfect. Above ground, uniforms, power, wartime politics, uncertainty. Below ground, silence, bones, inscriptions, masonry, and the possibility of touching the earliest material layers of Christian memory. This is one of the strongest narrative turns in the entire Vatican story. The search for origins happens under the cover of modern catastrophe. And when you dig under a place like St. Peter's, you are not only looking for structures, you are looking for confirmation, for legitimacy, for continuity, for the physical trace of a sacred claim. That is what raised the stakes so dramatically. Because if the excavators found what tradition said should be there, the implications would be enormous. And yet, before the greatest discovery, the underground world offered something smaller, and somehow even sadder. Not a grand monument. A child's object. A reminder that the dead city under the Vatican was once filled with ordinary human grief. One of the most powerful things archaeology can do is destroy abstraction. Empires are abstract. Doctrines are abstract. Civilizations are abstract. But a child's toy is not. Among the discoveries associated with the Vatican necropolis and the wider buried environment beneath the Basilica were intimate objects that suddenly made the dead feel close again. And one of the most emotionally striking images is that of a doll with articulated joints. A fragile object that once belonged not to a saint, not to an emperor, but to a child. That detail changes everything, because the dead city beneath the Vatican stops being an archaeological system and becomes personal. There were families here, children here, people who buried the young, mourned them, and left behind the small material traces of love. And from that intimate sorrow, the story makes one of its sharpest turns, from the human to the theological. Because deeper in the early Christian visual world, another unsettling question appears. Why does one early image of Christ look so much like a pagan solar deity? In one of the famous visual shocks connected to early Christian Rome, Christ can appear in imagery that resembles Helios or Apollo, radiant, solar, triumphal, in a way that blurs the boundary between emerging Christian symbolism and older pagan visual language, and that is deeply important. because it challenges simplistic ideas about early Christianity arriving in history fully separated from the world around it. Instead, the evidence suggests overlap, adaptation, visual borrowing, and a much messier cultural transition than people often imagine. This is not a trivial art historical detail. It is a fault line. Because once Christ appears with visual echoes of pagan divinity, viewers are forced into an uncomfortable but fascinating realization. Religions do not spread into empty space. They move through existing symbols. They inherit forms. They absorb languages of power and sacredness already familiar to the people seeing them. That means the Vatican's buried layers are not only preserving Christian origins, they are preserving Christianity in the act of becoming, still close enough to Rome to resemble it, still close enough to paganism to borrow its light. And then the story reaches its archaeological climax. Because after all the dust, secrecy, and expectation, the question becomes brutally direct. Did they find the bones of St. Peter? This is the moment where archaeology and faith collide most intensely. For centuries, Christian tradition held that St. Peter, the apostle and foundational figure in the authority of the Roman Church, was buried in this area. That claim was not minor. It was central. St. Peter's Basilica itself stood as a monumental statement built around that memory. So when excavations pushed deeper, the expectation was almost unbearable. And then came the first shock. A tomb space that seemed important, but no clear body where one might have expected it. An absence. And absence can be more destabilizing than discovery, because for a moment, it raises the possibility that the whole sacred geography might be more complicated than tradition had claimed. The search, instead of delivering triumph, produced uncertainty. But then the story changed. Nearby, in a side niche or adjacent location, researchers found bones associated with rich wrapping, including gold cloth, and signs that these remains had been handled, moved, and preserved with unusual care. This transformed the entire excavation. Now the question was no longer just where the remains were. It was why they had been relocated, who moved them, when, and whether these could genuinely be the bones connected to Peter's memory. The Vatican eventually advanced a strong claim regarding these remains, and for believers, this became one of the most emotionally charged archaeological affirmations in modern church history. But even beyond belief, the structure of the discovery is extraordinary. An expected grave, a disappointment, a hidden side space, bones in precious cloth, a forgotten inscription, a sacred narrative suddenly reassembled from fragments. It has the shape of revelation, and it also has the shape of a mystery that never fully closes. Because archaeology can point, suggest, support, and intensify. But at a site like this, material evidence is never separated from the power of interpretation, which makes it perfect for the Vatican, a place where stone and meaning are permanently fused. But even the Vatican's deepest burial zone is not the whole subterranean story. Because once you leave the Basilica itself, the underground world of Rome expands dramatically. And with it, the feeling that Christianity grew not in bright triumph, but in shadow. Beyond the Vatican's immediate underground layers lies the wider subterranean body of Christian Rome, the catacombs, a labyrinthine world stretching for vast distances beneath the city. Corridors, burial chambers, loculi, family spaces, devotional marks, and the accumulated record of a community that often lived close to vulnerability, persecution, memory, and death. When people imagine the catacombs, they often picture only skulls and tunnels. But what makes them powerful is not scale alone, it is voice. Because scratched into walls, written in fragments, and left in burial inscriptions, are traces of people who were never supposed to feel close to us anymore. Small texts, graffiti, invocations, appeals, names, farewells, crude but urgent human messages. These inscriptions matter because they shrink the distance of 2,000 years to almost nothing. A formal chronicle speaks from above. A scratched wall speaks from inside a life. And this is where the underground Christian world becomes emotionally overwhelming. Not because it is full of grand official declarations, but because it preserves pieces of ordinary people trying to leave behind one last line of meaning. A name, a prayer, a grief, a plea. Something like, remember me, forgive me. I was here. I loved. I suffered. Do not let me vanish. That is the power of catacomb history. It transforms early Christianity from doctrine into atmosphere, from empire into breath, from abstraction into bodies in stone corridors lit by small flames. And in the structure of this story, the catacombs do something else. They broaden the scale. The Vatican is no longer just one sacred point. It becomes the entrance to an entire underworld of continuity, burial, and memory beneath Rome. But even below the emotional power of bones and walls, there remains one final chamber in this descent. Not underground in stone, underground in secrecy, the archive. If the necropolis is the Vatican's buried body, then the Vatican Apostolic Archive is its buried mind. This is the level of the story that produces the strongest aura of secrecy. Long corridors of shelving, controlled access, documents no ordinary visitor can simply browse, centuries of correspondence, decrees, petitions, complaints, confessions of power, and decisions that touched the fate of kingdoms. The very existence of such an archive changes how people imagine the Vatican. Because once you understand that so much documentary memory has been preserved in one place, the institution begins to feel less like a small state and more like a vault of civilization. And the archive is powerful precisely because it is not made only of dramatic conspiracies. It is also made of intimate fragments. A letter tied to Marie Antoinette, administrative struggles, personal complaints, even the mundane difficulties of genius, like Michelangelo worrying about practical matters such as money, supplies, and work. That mixture is what gives the archive its strange authority. It contains the grand and the petty together, empires and errands, executions and expenses, theology and paperwork. And then, among all these shelves, emerges one of the most famous archival revelations of all, the Chignon parchment, a document of enormous symbolic weight because it showed that Pope Clement V had, in effect, granted absolution to leading members of the Knights Templar during the crisis that destroyed their order. That matters because for centuries, the Templar story was wrapped in myth, accusation, royal manipulation, and dramatic ruin. The image of the order had been shaped by fire, suppression, and legend. But the parchment complicated everything. It suggested that the papal position was more nuanced than the old simplified narrative allowed. And the terrible irony is this: a document that could have transformed the common understanding of one of medieval Europe's greatest scandals sat in darkness for centuries. That is the Vatican archive in one image, not merely secrecy, delay, truth preserved but unavailable, memory intact but locked away, history not destroyed, just withheld by obscurity. And that raises the deepest question of the entire video: not what the Vatican has hidden, but why truth in such a place so often arrives late. So look at the descent we have just made. At the surface, an Egyptian obelisk stands in sunlight like a silent witness from another empire. Below it, a Roman necropolis, a street of mausoleums buried alive beneath Christian stone. Then, secret wartime excavations, carried out in darkness while the modern world tore itself apart above. A child's doll, turning archaeology into grief. A fresco, where Christ still carries the visual memory of pagan divinity. Bones, wrapped in gold cloth, hidden beside an empty grave and pulled into one of the most consequential sacred identifications in Christian history. The catacombs, where walls still whisper with names and prayers. And finally, The Apostolic Archive, shelves of documents, letters, pardons, complaints, and lost explanations, culminating in a parchment that waited 700 years to complicate a legend. This is not one mystery. It is a vertical civilization, a stack of buried worlds. The Vatican above is only the visible crest. The real drama begins underneath, and perhaps that is the central paradox of the Vatican. It is the smallest sovereign state in the world by area, but in depth, almost no place feels greater. Not because it stretches downward physically more than every other place on Earth, but because each level below it carries another kind of descent into empire, into martyrdom, into burial, into memory, into theological uncertainty, into institutional secrecy, into the uneasy relationship between truth and control. That is what makes the Vatican so compelling. It is not only a site of faith, it is a site of layered possession over the past, a state founded on sacred truth, standing atop buried streets, disputed bones, syncretic imagery, sealed archives, and documents that sometimes appear centuries too late to save the people they concern. And that leaves one final uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Why does a state built on the idea of revealed truth guard what lies beneath it so carefully? Maybe because the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to separate certainty from interpretation. Maybe because institutions do not only preserve history, they curate it. And maybe because under the Vatican, history is never clean. It is mixed with dust, faith, politics, accident, fear, and silence. So if you were given access to the Vatican for just one day and allowed to open one hidden layer first, what would you choose? The buried necropolis? The bones of Peter? The pagan-looking Christ fresco? The wartime excavation records? The catacombs? Or the Apostolic Archive itself? And if you could open just one document from that archive, which one would it be? Write your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, places where history becomes a thriller, where stone hides memory, and where the deepest truths are often buried under the brightest surfaces, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because some places do not become more understandable the deeper you go. They become more mysterious.